All right, let's dive in. Few medical papers have ever stirred up as much controversy as the one published back in 1998 in the Lancet. We've all heard about it, it's been debated for decades, but what did it actually say? In this explainer, we're going to go straight to the source and break down, piece by piece, what was really published in that pivotal early report.
So, that's our big question today. Let's forget the headlines, forget the noise for a little bit. We are just going to walk through the paper itself, its methods, its findings, and crucially, its own conclusions. We're going to see the story it told way back in 1998. So let's pull back the curtain and look at what was actually on the page.
First thing, and this is so important to understand from the get-go, the authors themselves called this an early report. This was not some huge, definitive study, not at all. It was a close look, a clinical observation of just 12 kids who had been sent to a specialized clinic with a very specific and very puzzling set of problems.
So, the whole thing starts with a medical puzzle. You have this group of kids showing up in a clinic, and they all have this really strange and troubling combination of symptoms that doctors just couldn't seem to pin down to any known disease. So what were they seeing? Well, these were kids who, according to their parents and their medical records, had been developing totally normally. But then they started to regress. They lost skills they already had, like their ability to speak. And at the exact same time, they were all dealing with these really persistent gut problems: diarrhea, stomach pain, bloating. This double whammy, the developmental issues plus the gut issues, that was the heart of the puzzle.
So when you're faced with a puzzle like that, what do you do? Well, the paper lays out a really comprehensive investigation. The team wanted to understand exactly what was going on with these kids, both in their bodies and, if possible, in their brains.
Now, this group of kids, it was super specific. We're talking about just 12 children. 11 of them were boys. Their average age was 6. But the one thing they all had in common, the key piece of their history, was this pattern: normal development followed by a regression. And the investigation they did was incredibly thorough. First, they got these super detailed histories from the parents and from medical records. Then they did these deep dives into the kids' physical health. They did things like colonoscopies, where they could actually look inside the gut and take tissue samples. They did extensive neurological workups, MRIs, EEGs, to look for any brain issues. And on top of all that, they ran a whole battery of lab tests on their blood, urine, and stool. All right, so after all that digging, we get to the core of the paper. What did they actually find? Well, the results they reported really centered on two main things: what was happening inside the children's guts and a really specific question about timing. Okay, now we get to the number. The one that, let's be honest, became the focal point of pretty much all the discussion that came after. And that number is 8. That's 8 out of the 12 children who were part of this report.
And according to the paper, for those 8 children, here's the exact wording, which contains a really critical detail. It says, onset of behavioral symptoms was associated by the parents with measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination. Did you catch that? By the parents. The paper is being incredibly careful to report what the parents believed was the trigger. And for those 8 kids, the average time between the vaccine and the first behavioral symptoms was reported to be about 6 days.
But that was just one part of the story. The second major finding was consistent across the entire group. Every single one of the 12 children was found to have abnormalities in their intestines. This was the one physical link that tied them all together. And if we look at the data laid out here, a pretty fascinating pattern just jumps out at you. Look at the gut findings. They were remarkably consistent. 12 out of 12 had some kind of issue. 11 of them showed chronic inflammation in the colon. But then you get to that last line. Their neurological exams, the MRIs, the EEGs, all of that came back normal. 0 abnormalities. So the puzzle just got deeper. You've got this consistent gut disease in kids with developmental regression, but no obvious structural problems in their brains. And it wasn't just what they could see with a camera. The lab test turned up something interesting too. As you can see from this chart, which is based on a figure from the actual paper, the kids in the study had way higher levels of something called urinary methylmalonic acid. Now, the paper notes that this is often a sign of a functional vitamin B12 deficiency, another potential clue in this really complex picture. Okay, so you got all these findings, right? Inflamed guts, a timeline suggested by parents, but no obvious brain damage. So what do you do with that? Well, this is where the authors move into the discussion part of the paper. This is where they start to put forward a hypothesis, a theory, to try and connect the dots between the gut and the behavioral changes they were seeing. One of the big ideas they talked about was something called the opioid excess theory. Now, it sounds complicated, but the basic idea goes like this.
If a kid's gut is inflamed and not working right, it might not break down certain proteins from food, like from grains or milk. These little protein fragments, or peptides, could then get absorbed into the bloodstream, travel up to the brain, and start messing with normal development.
And that wasn't the only idea they floated. The paper also mentioned other possibilities. Things like a leaky gut that lets unwanted stuff through, or problems with the body's detoxification pathways, or maybe that functional B12 deficiency was directly affecting the developing brain. These were all just put out there as possibilities, all part of this bigger gut-brain idea.
So after laying out all the findings and all the theories, we finally get to the conclusion. And honestly, this might be the most important and probably the most often overlooked part of the whole paper: what the authors themselves said their work actually meant.
The paper doesn't end with some big, bold declaration. Instead, it's a really cautious summary and, more importantly, a clear call to action for the rest of the scientific community. And this, right here, this is the most crucial quote in the entire paper. In their own words, the authors wrote, "We did not prove an association between measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and the syndrome described." Let that sink in for a second. They are explicitly stating that their small observational report does not and cannot establish a cause and effect link. They couldn't be clearer. So if they didn't prove a link, what did they conclude? Well, they ended with this. They essentially positioned their work as a starting pistol. They were saying, hey, we've identified what might be a new syndrome and a possible association that desperately needs more rigorous investigation. It was a call for other scientists to pick up the baton and do the big, definitive studies.
And that's really where the 1998 paper leaves us. Not with answers, but with a set of really profound questions. Is this a real new syndrome? What is the actual connection between the gut and the brain in these children? And what is the role, if any, of environmental triggers like a vaccine? These were the huge questions this early report put on the table for the entire world of science to investigate.